has changed. At every twist and turn of society and the economy since, we've adapted to ensure we would continue to live with that promise. And at every corner, we have welcomed the people of many nations. Our diversity is absolutely core to who we are and what we offer. Our commitment to inclusion is hardwired. And we live it every day through our partnerships and through our vast network of alumni who span the world and bring the RMIT spirit to more than 130 countries. I know everyone participating, me today, joins in an urgent, deep desire to welcome our international students and researchers safely back to our Australian university campuses as soon as possible, and this will undoubtedly be a team effort between government at all levels and the sector. International education is a multi-billion-dollar sector, but more importantly, it connects us, it builds relationships, and it binds us to the region and the world. Pre-COVID, our universities contributed $41 billion to the Australian economy and supported almost 260,000 jobs. What's more, they allowed hundreds of thousands of people each year to realise their potential and contribute to economic and social vibrancy throughout the world. So there's a lot of energy behind this shared goal of ours, and many minds are at work to create solutions and safe passage back to the success story that is international education in this country. It's clearly time for a united approach, and I know we all look forward in this room and on the live stream to playing our part. Gabby, back to you.
Thank you, Martin. Before we continue, just some housekeeping to note. In the highly unlikely event of an emergency, the nearest emergency exit is out the rear of the auditorium and out onto Swanston Street. Please follow any instructions from security and observe social distancing. As a reminder, please direct any questions via the Go Soapbox web link and use the access code EDU21, that's EDU21, to enter the platform. Now I'd like to introduce the Honourable Phil Honeywood, CEO of IEAA. Phil has been IEAA's Chief Executive Officer since November 2011. Previously, he was a member of the Victorian State Parliament, Minister for Tertiary Education, Training and Multicultural Affairs, and Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Since retiring from politics, Phil worked at Stotts Business College and Cambridge International College. Please welcome Phil.
Thank you, Gabby. And Gabby's a great example of volunteerism in Australia. She's one of our 13 national board members and works for CEDA as a day job, but does a fantastic job supporting our research efforts, in particular with our association. Minister, Vice-Chancellor Martin and your governing council members who've joined you today, and another great group of volunteers. Other Vice-Chancellors, including Adam Shoemaker, the new, can we say new, Adam? The new Vice-Chancellor of Victoria University, great, and Duncan Maskell, who's far from new nowadays at University of Melbourne, welcome. To all the other universities represented here today, importantly to a number of CEOs and owners of independent higher education providers and vet providers, and to purpose-built student accommodation representatives, the whole ecosystem, if you like, of our industry is here today and our sector. And I think, Martin, first and foremost, I'd like to thank you for being a wonderful landlord to my association over all these years. And it was very interesting. I mean, we've been a well-behaved tenant for the past 12 months because we haven't been here. But when I came back to my office, would you believe, after 1 year, only 2 weeks ago, certainly there were a few of my indoor plants were just only root balls, but there, in magnificent presence, was a money plant. You know, there's wonderful Chinese origin money plants. Nobody had watered it for a full 12 months and it was still alive and kicking. So I think that's a metaphor today for our sector and where we're going. I should be advertising money plants. So it's been greatly appreciated, the wonderful partnership we've had with RMIT now for many years, and thank you as well, Chancellor Ziggy, for your strong support. Ladies and gentlemen, Australia is an exemplar nation in its governance initiatives for the dynamic international education sector. We're the only nation that has a formal National Council for International Education. It includes 6 relevant portfolio federal ministers, who I have the joy of meeting with up at Parliament, and 11 non-ministerial expert members. And I think it's a wonderful case where Australia can show the world how to bring disparate, often policy issues together in one council format. Importantly, the President of the Council for International Students of Australia is a full member of our council. So the voice of the students is very much at the centre of all of our deliberations, and we welcome the current President, Belle Lim. Where's Belle? Hi, Belle. Here today, and she's doing a great job. In equal measure, most of our state and territory governments and many of our city councils have also established robust and effective international education advisory committees. Indeed, Martin and I were recently members of the City of Melbourne's Knowledge City subcommittee, which came up with some great recommendations under your chairmanship. A coordinated approach has also been of crucial importance in the student-facing initiatives that have been effectively implemented by the education providers represented here today. Many of you have done some incredible heavy lifting for and on behalf of your student communities. The sector owes you and your staff a great debt of gratitude for putting students first during these incredibly difficult times. Despite the many obstacles that the current pandemic has required us to overcome, I myself am incredibly optimistic about the future of our dynamic sector, both within Australia and for Australia, and particularly when it comes to our external engagement in our own region. For as we all know, we have never just focused on bringing overseas students here to be taught in our classrooms, of our world-leading institutions. It's far more than that. While we're rightly very proud of our onshore education institutions, our sector is so much more than just onshore engagement by itself. It includes a strong focus on research collaboration. It includes transnational education delivery partnerships. And some of our universities here today have got incredibly fine and well-respected offshore bricks and mortar campuses. I'm thinking of this institution, RMIT Vietnam, which has done very well during the pandemic in Vietnamese enrolments at that campus. I'm thinking Malaysia with Monash, and of course we've also got Swinburne represented here today with Kuching and a number of others as well. So we are in the T&E space, but we could do a lot more compared to, for example, the UK. And obviously, given the pandemic, we're much focused as well, ladies and gentlemen, on the increasing emphasis on learning abroad programs for our domestic students. Minister, we also have to thank you and your government for initiating and maintaining the funding of our nation's much envied New Colombo Plan Scholarship Program. This was, I guess, a thought bubble initially of Julie Bishop when she was Education Minister, and she really pushed that to the end conclusion. Anybody who can get $100 million out of Tony Abbott at that time deserves our accolades from the sector, and happily that funding's been maintained in the forward estimates. I'd now like to make 3 quick points associated with the development of the proposed new national strategy for international education for our nation 2021 to 2030. While we can all relate to the 3 words that we've attached to the strategy at the moment, which are connected, creative and caring, the words that I'll focus on briefly now are sustainability, accessibility and diversification. First is sustainability. The COVID pandemic has forced us all to accept that new modes of delivery will be crucial going forward. We should rightly celebrate Australia's long-standing pedagogical emphasis on creative learning, critical thinking and project-based teamwork. Coincidentally, these are now the very attributes that global employers expect from highly motivated, resilient young graduates. So we've got a pedagogical dividend, some might say more by luck than design, but we've got there anyway. However, as a sector, we must now be nimble in emphasising innovation with online and blended learning options. More genuine, equal partnership delivery models with other nations' education providers, more 2+2s and all of that, and underpinning meaningful pathway agreements with, for example, overseas-based high schools, VET and higher education institutions. And one of my fellow expert members here today, who's also on the Council for International Education, Derek Scott, Principal of Hailbury, is doing an outstanding job with something like 10 offshore campuses now, many of them in China, Vietnam, and that's really an exemplar for our high school sector. Bearing in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that the Kiwis, who always try outdo us over here. The Kiwis, 20% of their full fee paying international students are high school students. Here in Australia, 3%. So we could do a great deal more to provide a pipeline from the high school sector into post-secondary studies for our nation. And we all know as well that if they're in our high school sector, be it offshore or be it onshore, then they're going to integrate much better with our wider Australian community before they go on to do post-secondary here in this country. Accessibility. As a sector, we have worked and in many cases surprised ourselves with our rapid transition to online engagement. I know, Minister, this is an area that you have been involved with for many years now. We still haven't seen that online delivery paper that you wrote for Tony Abbott, which, Tony being Tony, I don't think you let it out of the inbox, but I'm sure that it was a very profound document given all the consultation you did many years ago on online learning. And of course, whether it be our outstanding educators, our national regulators, our professional staff, or our students themselves, much has been realised when it comes to us being more accessible. And I know our national regulator, TESCA, is here today, and we thank them incredibly for pivoting so quickly when it came to being flexible on regulatory issues in offshore delivery. And of course, in all of this, we've included a new emphasis on virtual learning abroad, which has particularly resonated with domestic students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, those with disabilities who find travel overseas daunting, and even the increasing number of young people who are genuinely concerned about reducing their carbon footprint. Of course, for many overseas students who post-COVID may not be able to afford a study experience here, then we are now providing them with extensive and outstanding online curriculum options. My final point is around diversification. For too long, we've been aware of the need to diversify away from both our student source countries and our emphasis on certain courses. The commerce and business faculties, of course, have done very well for a number of years because of the incredible appetite for business degree courses. Notwithstanding the best efforts of many providers in this room today, we still face significant structural impediments, however. Having key government departments, particularly Home Affairs, working on policy initiatives more attuned to the sector's aspirations will be crucial to our future success. The three elements that I've referred to comprise only a small proportion of our sector's ecosystem. Over the years, we've now got an incredibly dynamic, robust, purpose-built student accommodation sector represented here today, and I know how difficult it's been for them with just so many empty student apartments lying dormant, and I know they want to play a key role in bringing students back under that PBSA sector as well. And there's many other issues that we're dealing with now as well. I live at a residential college, which my wife's the head of, at the rival institution down the road, Duncan's institution. And what we're finding there is that living amongst young people nowadays, mental health issues, be it domestic students or international students, are just so crucial, and we've really got to get on top of some really meaningful programs and interventions when it comes to mental health. So they're just other aspects, of course, that my fellow expert members and I will be dealing with when it comes to providing a comprehensive strategy going forward. Much more needs to be addressed, and we haven't the time to discuss that today, but I thank my fellow 10 expert members as we finalise the National Strategy 2021 to 2030, and we now look forward to hearing from the Minister, particularly in his capacity as Chairman of the National Council for International Education, about his thoughts, his aspirations, both personal, Alan, and on behalf of the government, for the sector, and to launch our strategy's formal consultation phase. Over to you.
Introduce you. Thank you, Phil. Just a quick note that if you're trying to get onto the Wi-Fi, the RMIT guest login, the key is 859480. That's 859480. Now I'd like to introduce the Honourable Alan Tudge, Minister for Education and Youth. Minister Tudge is the federal member for Aston and has previously served as Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure, Minister for Immigration, Citizenship, Migrant Services and Multicultural Affairs, Minister for Human Services and Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. Without further ado, please welcome Minister Alan Tudge.
Well, thank you so much, Gabby, for the introduction, and to Vice-Chancellor Martin and Chancellor Siggy, thanks for hosting me here today, and all the other Vice-Chancellors, the other members of the International Council of Education, and everybody else. Thanks for joining us here. To those who are watching down the line, welcome as well. And I know the people in this room had a more traditional Education Minister welcome as they came through the doors at RMIT. I suppose I could say it's great to have students back on campus, Martin. And isn't free speech wonderful? So those people down the line won't get that particular joke, but I also acknowledge the traditional owners of this land as well before beginning my formal remarks. Phil, thank you also for the work which you do, heading up your council and being such a strong advocate for your council and for international education more broadly. Today, I take this opportunity to provide some of my thoughts on international education, as well as obviously formally launching the consultation phase as we develop the international education strategy for 2021 to 2030. And as everybody knows in this room and who is watching, it's been a pretty challenging time for the sector. And I appreciate that lower enrolments today, due to border closures, will have an impact over several years, not just over last year or this year. However, any disruption to any business model creates opportunities as well, and I think there's an opportunity today to rethink some of these business models and to look more optimistically and positively towards the future. And in this address this morning, I want to outline some of my thoughts in relation to this as we go into this consultation phase. Really, most of my discussion will be on that strategic element in the medium and longer term, but of course I also want to address some of the short-term challenges as well, and some of my thinking and our government's thinking as to when we may be able to get international students back. Let me start though by just reflecting on the success of international education generally. It's, as you all know, it has been a tremendous success story for Australia. Started, of course, at least in higher education, back with the Colombo Plan in 1951, which brought future leaders to Australia and provided them with an education, networks and a positive experience of Australia, which they then went back to the region. And it's been a tremendously successful mechanism for foreign diplomacy and really set the scene for larger things to come. You fast forward to at least 2019 and the number of international students had grown to an incredible 750,000 students, largely across higher education, but also, of course, vocational education, English language provision and schools. At many of our top universities now, international students comprise more than a third of all enrolments. The sector is a $37.5 billion one, and it's estimated that it supports 250,000 jobs in our country, making it the fourth largest export industry and of course the largest here in Victoria. Australia now is the third largest provider of international education in the world. And it's perhaps, while broadly understood here, little understood in the public, that only around 40% of the economic contribution of international students is actually in fee revenue. The other 60% is in the broader contribution to our economy, and Phil, you mentioned some of those sectors, in accommodation, in restaurants, in other services, in tourism, and of course many people bring their parents over here as well to visit while they are studying here. Much of the growth that I mentioned to get to that 750,000 figure in 2019 has occurred in the last 2 decades alone. Even in the last decade, unbelievable growth. In 2002, there were only 230,000 students, and there were 400,000 students a decade later in 2012. So we've gone from 230,000 2 decades ago, 400,000 a decade ago, 750,000 now. Like an unbelievable growth in international student enrolments. Chinese students in particular have been a very large contributor of this growth, particularly in the last decade. And they now make up about 3/4 of all international enrolments at some of our largest public universities. And this incredible growth has been good for our economy, but even before COVID hit, I think strains were starting to appear, and arguably the continued growth, which I was just describing, wasn't sustainable in my view. And this is particularly true for our public institutions, of course, which have a broader mandate to serve. Now, this brings us to our current time. Everyone knows the story. Last February, we began closing our international borders, initially to China and then to the rest of the world, and they've remained closed since. I remember the decision when we made this, and it was a very big call at the time, but in hindsight, it was the right call, and it has been probably the single most important thing that the federal government has done in getting control of COVID in this country. And I think had we not made that decision then Australia would not be in the position where it is today from a health perspective and economically. And where we are today is the envy of the world. And so it's important to keep that context in mind. But of course, closing the borders significantly disrupted international students. And not just international students, but the entire sector, as Phil mentioned. In 2019, we started the year with around 480,000 continuing international students, with another 150,000 entered at the beginning of the year for semester 1, and a further 130,000 entered for semester 2. That normal pattern couldn't occur last year and has not been able to occur this year. Very significant numbers. Now, while some started online, many also deferred their studies, preferring to wait until travel is again possible. I think at least the relatively positive news, though, is that the impact on enrolments, at least in the aggregate, when I look at the data, has not been as great as perhaps what many of you expected when COVID first hit. Enrolments at the end of 2020, which is the last sort of full data that we have, were only down 7% compared to 2019, and only 5% for our higher education sector. Now, you put that into perspective, and for our universities at least, that meant that international enrolments last year, despite the borders being closed, were the same as they were in 2018. I'm not saying that was a terrific outcome for you, but I'm just putting that into perspective. But I do appreciate that some institutions have had greater challenges in this regard, with much more significant declines in international student enrolments, and the ELICOS sector particularly so, and some other secondary sectors as well, such as the accommodation sector. I also realise that the numbers I just gave were enrolments. When you look at commencements, they have declined more rapidly, particularly from Indian students. They're largely holding up with the Chinese students, as Phil was indicating. And we're obviously keeping a very close eye on what those commencements figures look, in particular as we go into this year and as we get further data for 2021. Many of the institutions, though, moved very quickly to wide-scale digital delivery and offered support for students overseas to stay engaged with their Australian education as they did it online. Among many examples, the University of Technology Sydney has established offshore learning centres for students studying remotely in China and Vietnam, creating hubs where students can go and get academic and other support as required. Amongst the English language providers, at the start of 2020, only 3% of them were offering online English language provision. Over the course of that year, an incredible 50% now offer online provision. So an incredible transformation in just that 12-month period. And the federal government, we've supported this digital transformation by changing regulations to allow students to study fully online. And we've changed, importantly, the visa arrangements, which I did when I was Immigration Minister last year, to ensure that your post-study work rights were still preserved if COVID did not allow you to be studying in Australia on campus. Moreover, we've significantly increased domestic enrolments in higher education and vocational education, and have opened up the domestic market for English language acquisition as well. We also provided an additional $1 billion for university research. Now, all of these measures have collectively supported the financial viability of the sector. So, when will we see international students come back to Australia again? And can I at least provide a roadmap so that the sector can have more certainty? I'll tell you, there wouldn't be a day that goes past when I'm not asked these two questions. I will say that we're looking forward to welcoming back international students who remain overseas, and we certainly thank them for their patience today. You know, I hope they appreciate that we closed the borders for a reason. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've followed the health advice from Australian medical experts. And while I'd like to provide certainty and predict a very concrete time as to which we can welcome back international students in large numbers, I hope you realise that the unpredictability of this virus does not allow me, or anyone else for this matter, to make concrete guarantees. And I think you even see the last few days with the virus having an outbreak in Brisbane, state borders closing all of a sudden at a moment's notice gives you a sense of that unpredictability that we still have at this particular moment. However, you know, with the vaccine rollout underway, I'm increasingly hopeful that student arrivals in large numbers will occur by semester 1 of next year. Because we expect that every Australian adult who wants to be vaccinated will have access to their first jab by the end of October of this year. And the research tells us that COVID-19 vaccines do protect lives and livelihoods. But there are challenges, because while the vaccine is very effective, and the research confirms this, at controlling the symptoms, we do not know yet whether the vaccine will control the transmission of the virus. And furthermore, a global authentication system for vaccination certificates, which I've been talking to the sector about since I was doing the immigration role, is still a long way off at this stage. So there are considerable challenges still, and they do create this uncertainty. Now, my hope and our expectation is that we will have more clarity on these issues by mid-year, at which time we should be able to give you much greater certainty about border openings, and particularly in relation to first semester for 2022. So again, I hope you appreciate the predicament that we are in as well, in not being able to give you absolute clarity at this stage. But we certainly look forward to the middle of the year having that better research on transmissions to be able to give you that greater clarity mid-year. Of course, though, there are still opportunities to bring back students in small, phased pilots, and this would occur if an institution works with a state or territory government, develops a plan, gets that approved by the Chief Medical Officer of the state and territory government, and is for quarantine beds above and beyond the quarantine beds which exist for Australians at the moment. If those plans are developed and are presented to us, then of course we would be looking at those very closely. There are many institutions that I've spoken to who are working on such plans, and many state governments who are working on such plans, but to date I've not received any concrete proposals. And here in this great state of Victoria, which I'm from, we don't even have quarantine beds open for Australians at this stage. And of course, that's still the nation's priority and our government's priority is to return Australians. I mentioned at the outset that a disruption to a business model, as we have seen, forces a rethink of that model. It does that with every industry. And it'll force a rethink more broadly of the international education strategy for the nation. I think further, education, like most other industries, is being disrupted by digital technology. And this, like in all industries, presents massive opportunities but also threats. The opportunity is the huge market that different product offerings based more on online education could serve. The threat, of course, is that any institution in the world could be in the same market, including in our own. So in thinking this through as we set our new strategy and the policy responses that will follow, I want to make two observations. The first one is that we need to ensure that going forward we think through the objective of international students, particularly the objective for publicly funded institutions, and that we continue to deliver on the full range of objectives for international students for those publicly funded institutions, and not just one. The second thing, and in part coming out of this, there's a need and opportunity to have a greater diversity in the nations we focus on and in the products that we offer. Let me deal with this first one. In my view, there's at least 4 objectives for international education. The first, to provide revenues for institutions and the economy. The second, to enhance the learning experience of Australian students. The third, to ensure that Australia has the supply of workforce skills that we need to continue to power our economy. And fourth, to strengthen our people-to-people connections with other nations and support their ongoing development. You know, all of these objectives are important, particularly for publicly funded institutions. And if anything, I've been concerned that the relentless drive for revenue in order to fund research, which then drives global rankings, has meant there's an imbalance between the first objective and the others. Our institutions have been very good at the first objective, particularly in the last decade, as I've outlined, but we have the opportunity to also be better at the others. And in particular, the objective of enhancing the classroom experience for Australian students. Because after all, the primary objective of publicly funded institutions is to educate Australian students. International students can strongly support this objective by creating more diverse classrooms and bringing experiences and insights from around the world. You know, I myself, I had the opportunity to be an international student, as perhaps many did, abroad when I did my master's at Harvard University. And at Harvard, they very deliberately and carefully designed student cohorts to include an optimal balance of domestic and international students and to ensure that a mix of countries and regions are represented in that group of international students. It's fair to describe it, at Harvard where I went, there was an informal quota system in place. The experience for the American students at Harvard would not have been the same if the classroom was made up only of other American students or only of other American and Australian students, for that matter. Now, perhaps it's unfair to make a comparison to Harvard. It is, as it has the reputation and wealth to pick and choose from around the world. But my point on this is that I think that we can be better on this front, because having up to 60% of a classroom with international students of just one or two countries, I don't think is optimising the Australian student experience or the international student experience. And I, perhaps like you, hear constant feedback along these lines. As you'd know, and Phil, you touched on this, just 2 countries account for more than 55% of all international student enrolments at university. And not only does that limit the diversity of viewpoints and perspectives in our classrooms, and Martin touched on the importance of diversity in your opening remarks, but it also lowers the resilience of the international education sector to changes in global demand, as we saw with the Indian student downturn after 2009, and particularly here in Victoria. we go to the third objective of international education that I outlined, I also believe that we can do better to ensure that international enrolments in Australia are better matched to our nation's future skills needs. Now, the National Skills Commission has identified our greatest skills needs in emerging fields that will drive our growth in the future. And they include data and digital specialists, the health professions, and engineers, especially those in the energy field. However, currently almost half of international enrolments at universities are concentrated in commerce, while fields like engineering, maths, technology and health, where we see the future growth and where we know we're going to have shortages, attract a significantly lower enrolment share than the OECD average does. In the US, by comparison, 2/3 of international student enrolments are in those areas of engineering, of science and in health. So it can be done in those areas. The question is, can we use levers, and I think including migration levers, to encourage more students to study in the areas where we know where we have shortages? We did this, and again I did this when I was Immigration Minister, encourage students to go to regional areas by using migration levers. Could we do the same again in terms of encouraging students to go into those areas where we have skills shortages? Finally, from the objective of people-to-people linkages and supporting the developments of other nations, I again believe that there are opportunities to do more, particularly by extending further the reach of our education systems to beyond in-country learning. So as well as refocusing on those critical objectives of international education, I see significant opportunities for Australian international education to continue to diversify more broadly. I touched on the issue of diversifying the source countries, which would enhance the student experience and reduce risk, as well as the fields of study. But I think there's also an opportunity to diversify the education delivery models, and in doing so, to grow and reach new markets from around the world. Now, I've been thinking about this for 7 or 8 years now, since I headed up that task force in opposition back in 2013. When you look at our 2019 figures, around 80% of international students at Australian universities were in the traditional onshore delivery model, largely living and studying in person in Australia for the duration of their degree. And the students who took up these opportunities were largely from the wealthiest segments of the source countries. Now, in-country study, of course, will continue to be a core offering from our education institutions, but there are opportunities for institutions in Australia to build out a broader set of delivery options and reach a massive market which is requiring tertiary education but may not be able to afford a full-time in-country experience in Australia or in another rich country. India, for example, has set the ambition of training more than 400 million people. Indonesia has a target of educating 57 million students by 2013. These are enormous numbers. Only a fraction of those numbers would be able to come to Australia to do in-country study or to go to another wealthy country like America or the UK and afford to do that in-country learning. And moreover, it's highly unlikely that the institutions in those countries will have sufficient capacity for places like India or Indonesia to be able to reach those targets. So we in Australia and through our institutions have the opportunity to at least partially meet that market through greater use of online delivery or hybrid learning models at different price points. And this could be in both full courses or indeed in micro-credentials. One university vice-chancellor commented to me recently that his vision for the future was that his institution would potentially educate hundreds of thousands of Australians through providing customised training and learning for the existing Australian workforce. Why not a further vision of educating millions of people in our region through innovative online and hybrid courses? You look at the size of the market. The global e-learning market is forecast to grow from $130 billion today to more than $470 billion by 2026. Talk about growth. And it's largely driven by students around the world seeking lower cost education, as well as greater flexibility in how and where they learn. And while many Australian providers have had some standout successes in this area, more can be done. And in the view of people such as Harvard's Clay Christensen, and we were just discussing earlier, must be done, or risk other countries undercutting our traditional markets. Other countries, by the way, as perhaps you know, are already moving into this space. The universities UK, they reported recently that of the entire United Kingdom international student market, 58% of their students were not in-country students. 58%. Our comparable figure is 22%. What an opportunity that is. India has also made a huge investment in its online course platform. Singapore is moving into this space as well. And what's more, it's not just other tertiary institutions moving into this space from other countries. You've got companies who are moving into this space as well, and they'll potentially be competitors of the future as well. IBM, Google, Amazon, giants of commerce around the world have introduced their own micro-credentials. New companies which you'd be familiar with, Udemy, Coursera, are reimagining how education and training can be delivered. Our government has been supporting digital growth in the sector. Last year, as you'd know, Austrade launched a Study with Australia pilot campaign, which offered access to free online courses from Australian providers. It achieved a remarkable 836,000 enrolments, demonstrating the potential to grow Australia's online market share and tap into new markets. Another big possibility is expanding a delivery of VET and industry-led international education. We see this on a small scale with a number of the Australian VET providers, particularly TAFEs actually, who are delivering bespoke training across the Indo-Pacific. William Anglis, for example, delivered tailored hospitality training to employees for the Singapore Grand Prix and international hotel groups. And our competitors from other countries have also been delivering this type of voc ed at much larger scale. For instance, German vet colleges based in Vietnam and India train tens of thousands of students each and every year. And I think, again, their success highlights the potential for us to expand our offshore delivery, not only of higher education, but of vocational education and potentially English language provision to reach larger cohorts of learning. Now, I want to conclude just by summing up by saying that in response to, I think, these challenges, these disruptions, we're kicking off the formal consultation of the International Education Strategy today. It will be developed over the next few months. I'm asking for these ideas to be incorporated and developed, and for policy ideas to come out of this work, which Phil and many others of this room will be overseeing. And I'm asking for your input and your expertise as we develop this new international education strategy. As I've outlined here, I think there's massive opportunities still for international education in Australia, and particularly through chasing that broader market through online and hybrid models, and potentially, of course, having campuses abroad, as Phil indicated as well. So we've got a great opportunity as we develop this strategy. You have a minister who is very committed to this, as I have been for many, many years, as Phil knows. So we welcome your feedback, and with that we formally launch the consultation phase of the International Education Strategy, and perhaps I'll be back here, Martin, in a few months' time as we conclude that and launch what the policy responses are as well. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, if you could just have a seat. We're just going to do a quick fireside chat. Is the mic following me? Yes, it is. Great. Thank you for your speech, Minister. In it, you talk about how the growth in international education over the last few decades has been unsustainable. To me, it seems like a hallmark of our success that we've been able to bring in so many international students and expose them to an on-campus education. But what you seem to be saying is that you don't want to see that model go forward in the same way.
I'm not saying that. I'm just looking at the growth where we've had a more than threefold growth over the last 2 decades. And could you have a more than threefold growth over the next 2 decades of on-campus international students? I'm not convinced that we could, particularly if you didn't have such a threefold increase in domestic students. And so then the weight of the international students would overwhelm the domestic students. And that's what I'm saying, and particularly for the publicly funded institutions. I appreciate that some private institutions, they'll be particularly targeted at international students, and that's their particular business model. But the publicly funded institutions, their primary objective, of course, is to educate Australian students. And international students, as I've articulated, can be a tremendous source to enhance the experience of Australian students and, of course, bring in revenue and do those other things. And we need to make sure we balance out those objectives. That's my main message.
International students also come here for an education as well. Enhancing the education of Australian students is not the only thing they come here for, but yeah. And so early on in the pandemic, there was some messages from the government about international students not being welcome here and being asked to go home, and that was heavily implied in some of that messaging that the Prime Minister delivered in March. In light of that, do you think it's really advantages to the sector to be saying now that we shouldn't go back to that level of growth that we had before?
Well, I mean, 2 points. One being that's not what the Prime Minister said, nor what I said. The message at that particular time was that if you don't have the finances to be able to stay, and knowing that borders were going to be closing, not just in Australia but around the world, you may consider your options here in Australia. So I just want to be clear on that particular message because I know it was interpreted in particular ways. Now, you know, I'm also clear today that we want international students back. You know, we're very thankful for their patience. We're thankful for the fact that they've gone online and in some cases started their degrees or continuing their education in an online manner. And I'm trying to give as much assurance as possible that we're working very hard to reopen the borders so they can come and have that experience in Australia, and they will still have their post-study work rights to boot as well. My point about the growth is just purely on the mathematics. It's just purely on the maths. And so in terms of if we're wanting further growth, I just think there is, as I was articulating, unbelievable growth opportunities in the online and the hybrid markets. When you look at those countries, a couple of examples which I gave of just India and Indonesia, let alone some of the other countries which are rapidly developing, and how they want to upskill their populations. Tremendous opportunity. And I think when I think about the growth of the international education sector, I think we'll get perhaps more growth there in the future than we will from more students coming and doing in-country full-time learning.
Yeah, and so you mentioned about some of those digital opportunities. What do you see as Australia's value add? That's a really crowded space, and a lot of other countries and institutions have been operating in that space for a long time. What do you see that Australia can add in terms of its value proposition for online education?
Well, in some respects, it's the same thing that we offer for students coming here to study in person. The main thing that they want is a very high quality education, and they get that if they come and study here at an Australian institution. Of course, when they come and study full-time in Australia as well, you get the benefit of living in Australia for a few years in many cases, and many people, but actually only about 16% of people will stay on permanently afterwards, although many more do stay on for at least a couple of years afterwards to work. So I think that's the first thing. We've got the institutions which are well known as being high quality to start with. And then I think already many institutions developing high quality online products as well, and offering other structured support to support those students abroad. But you're right, it'll be competitive. But if you made a comparator to every other industry which has been disrupted, we have to go down this space in any case. Not completely. There's always going to be traditional models, but I think we're already seeing this in Australia, where more and more people are doing online learning or blended courses or flipped classroom models. And I think we're going to see more of that in Australia, let alone the opportunities abroad.
And in terms of, you mentioned some of the migration-related levers that the government has at its disposal to try and encourage students to educate themselves in areas of skills needs. How do you see that playing out, especially given that we tried that a couple of decades ago and it led to a lot of long processing times, maybe 15 years ago, long processing times in terms of visa applications for students who were waiting for close to 5 years for decisions on their residency status. How do you see that being different this time around?
Well, I was referring to potentially, and I just float this idea, it is not our policy, but it's something that we could explore, as using levers at our disposal to encourage students to study in the areas where we know we've got skills shortages. We did that in terms of encouraging people to go to some of the regional campuses or campuses outside of the big capitals by providing an additional year of post-study work rights, which for many people, that's a big deal. And can we look at those sort of levers to encourage people equally? I mean, you're talking about permanent residency, which would be at the other end of the time. So after you've spent at least 2 or 3 years here, then you might apply for your permanent residency. I can't, I used to know all these figures when I was doing immigration about what the average wait time is for that. But clearly we go through a pretty rigorous process in terms of giving people permanent residency because, permanent residency in this country is a golden ticket for many people. There's millions of people from around the world that want permanent residency here, and so we're very rigorous in terms of doing that.
So obviously we're in a period of quite a lot of uncertainty with COVID and without knowing when international students are going to be able to come back. Are there any plans by the government to try and organise any repatriation flights or off their own bat to try and get international students to come in, or is the government expecting that the university sector will deal, or the university and the higher ed, and tertiary education will deal with that themselves?
I mean, to date, our focus has been on Australians returning to Australia. And we've put in place some repatriation flights, as you'd be aware, for returning Australians. At the moment, as I said, in Victoria, we don't have any quarantine beds for anybody. Nobody can come can fly into Melbourne. We're asking for institutions to work with their respective state and territory governments because the National Cabinet agreed that states and territories would be responsible for quarantine arrangements. And they're the closest on the ground, the chief health medical officers, in managing the local health conditions. So that's the criteria, is that develop a proposal which is agreed between the institution and the state government, state or territory government, get it ticked off by the chief medical officer of that state and territory government, and make sure that there's quarantine beds above and beyond those which are already in existence for returning Australians, and then present that to us. Now, I expect there to be some good proposals put to me in the not too distant future. I've certainly had discussions with government leaders, including Premier Marshall, who's perhaps the most forward-leaning on this, as well as university leaders who are working on these plans. But I haven't seen these plans to date, and obviously we'll be looking at those very rigorously, because what we don't want is any outbreak to occur in terms of the virus, which then triggers broader repercussions for the broader public, as we've just seen in a smaller scale in Brisbane now, and disrupted hundreds of thousands of people who had travel arrangements organised for their Easter holidays. So this is the tricky balance. And we've laid out a process. We're asking people to follow that process and present those plans to us. And if we can do that, then we may well be in the position to get reasonable numbers in the second half of this year, while then waiting for the vaccine to be rolled out this year. And as I said, my increasing hope then is that we'll be able to have more significant numbers for the beginning of 2021.
Great.
2022, sorry.
All right, well, I think we might have to leave it there just because we're out of time. Thank you, Minister, for your time today. And thank you to Phil and Martin as well. And thanks to everyone who put through their questions online. I've definitely drawn on some of those in asking the Minister. As the Minister noted, the Council is forming a new strategy which will go to sector consultation. So all of us here today, please keep those questions in mind and keep advocating for positive action for our sector. And let's learn from this crisis to come back stronger and better. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gabby. Thanks for having me.